As people come down, I want to say one other thing that came up from a discussion we had at lunch, which is really important to keep in mind that if we say that you can change a particular behavior by a few percent, again, as someone who's thinking about public and private governance, what things can we do to change behavior to reduce carbon emissions, that the household sector is so large that even a several percentage change in household behavior can make a remarkable difference overall. And just let me give you one quick example, which is that pie chart that I showed you that had the U.S. share at between 30 and 40% roughly, the household share of the U.S. total. That household share alone is equal to all of the emissions from every source in every country in South America. Right? So that when you change a particular household behavior by 10%, assuming it's not a trivial behavior, often you're changing that behavior as much as entire countries or as much as entire industry sectors. And as someone who used to have to regulate those, I can appreciate the value of being able to achieve those kind of gains. I know Amanda and I did a paper a while back on idling with a bunch of people in the room. And we found that if you could just change idling by a quite small percentage in the U.S., you could get 600 million gallons of gas saved every year, which is equal to, I forget what it was, the carbon emissions of all the aluminum smelting sector or something like that. So let's just always keep, to me, it's important to keep that in mind as we're thinking about how much plasticity matters. The amount of plasticity that matters in part is relevant to the technical potential of the behavior, which has to be looked at a global level on some level, and then compared against the other alternatives that could have been selected. So, all right, let's move to our next panel, and we've got Paul moderating. And now this is going to be complicated. We're going to test our expert help here because we have some folks videoing in too.
3 people calling. So I'm going to dial in. So we'll see all answers at one time.
Hello.
Hello.
All right, so it looks like we have all 3. Maybe.
Hello.
So we can see Diana, Christian, and then Edgar. Do you have your video on? We can't see Edgar.
I can see Edgar. I don't know. Maybe he's...
You can see Edgar?
Yes.
Okay, very good. We're going to try to make this technology work.
Yeah.
Now,
So do you have slides?
I have a couple,
Okay.
and I hope they will be here.
All right. And then what's the name, guys?
Well, what's the name, guys? Yeah, there we are. Yeah.
All right. So you can use that to navigate your slides.
Okay. Yeah, well, the first one just is the program for the panel and who's on it. And, as you heard, we have 3 remote panel members. So we're doing a good job for reducing the carbon footprint. We have 2 people who are not traveling from Europe to be here for a 2-day conference. I think I won't say more about this. Maybe I will let the panel members introduce themselves a little bit. I want to say a little bit more about the substance. And there we go. The first thing to be said is that this is talking about indirect emissions from household activities, which is something that the behavioral wedge paper did not get into, but which, according to a lot of analyses, are bigger than the direct emissions. And what I mean by indirect emissions, this is something that's best estimated by life cycle analysis, an approach that our first speakers are steeped in. And if you look at this diagram that's kind of rough that I quickly threw together, you can look at consumption categories, which you can think of in terms of attributes of well-being that households experience: mobility, shelter, food, clothing, manufactured products, and so forth that provide well-being. Each of these has a product life cycle that goes from raw materials acquisition to production of products to distribution, retailing, So on consumption, acquisition of products, use of products, end-of-life treatment of products. The highlighted portions are where there can be, roughly, where there can be direct household emissions, which means that the household is buying energy and using it at home or in their motor vehicles. And everything else is indirect. There are a lot of things that are indirect. Life cycle analysis includes analysis across the rows in this diagram. Looking at mobility overall, and a portion of that is what you do at home, but portions of it are not. Air travel is not exactly direct, and certainly the manufacturing of vehicles is not direct. The direct for mobility is relatively large. For shelter, it's relatively large. For food, it's minuscule. You're talking about cooking. You're not talking about agriculture and distribution and wholesale freezing of foods and all of this kind of stuff. Or waste disposal, which has environmental impacts not limited to greenhouse gas emissions, but there's greenhouse gas emissions associated with that as well. So there is a way to move forward from the behavioral wedge paper, which looked only at the direct emissions by household activities, and to start looking at the indirect emissions. And that implies that there are a whole bunch of actors who can try to change the indirect emissions, and they exist at all of these life cycle stages, including in governments, but outside of governments, in the behavioral, in the non-governmental activities that we'll be talking about, focusing on tomorrow, there are all of these actors at all of these stages. They can influence their peers, other actors in the same stage. They can influence their suppliers upstream in the life cycle. They can influence their customers or their waste disposal people downstream in the life cycle. And there are all of these opportunities. And there is a need to identify in all of these cells to begin, which are the ones that have high technical potential. And when you look at those, as we did in the behavioral wedge paper, then you say, what's the behavioral plasticity? What's the initiative feasibility of intervening in that cell? And what's the reasonably achievable emissions reductions? So, that is, what did I do? I made this go away. Okay, there we go. The last slide that I have, I may have already said this. I think I basically have. The first speakers will be talking mostly about the technical potential in the area of indirect emissions. The last speakers will be mostly talking about behavioral plasticity, a domain in which there's not a whole lot of research, at least not that I'm aware of. But you'll be talking about behavioral plasticity in some areas where there is research, and that should give us an idea of ways to think going forward. And at this point, I will turn this over to Edgar. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
And do we have slides from you?
We have Edgar's slides. If he wants to share your screen, you can do that, or we can just put up your slides. Doesn't matter. Up to you.
Can you see my screen now?
Hold on 1 second.
While we're doing this, I will just offer the idea that I hope that this kind of process in a conference like this can get made even more simple. If we didn't have amazingly sophisticated help here, and I know I'm a personal techno-peasant, so I'm a part of the problem, but but if this kind of thing is going to become the routine, you can't have to have someone who's as talented as what we have here today in order to make these kind of processes work. And I know there are lots of different systems, but Vandy invests a lot in these systems, and yet it isn't easy to get someone's pace up and their slides and to rotate them quickly among the different participants.
The behavioral plasticity of reducing air travel to meetings like this is a real issue.
Right. And oddly enough, the technology in this kind of event is a piece of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally jinxed me. I'm trying to pull it up. It's connected. It's down here. It's just not wanting to pop up full screen for some reason.
You maybe want to open my presentation and forward it when I tell you?
Yeah, I can do that as a backup.
Yeah.
All right, Edgar, I have your presentation up, and I'll just follow along with you.
Okay, thank you. This is Edgar Hertwich. I am a professor of industrial sustainability at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I've been here for 3.5 years. Before that, I was at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, where the second speaker, Diana Ivanova, was one of my PhD students. If we go to the second slide, I'm going to try to forward this as well. So this was for me the starting point of my engagement, or like the first big contribution was to look at the global picture of how important are households, government, and investment if you calculate emissions in the way that Paul just talked about, assigning the emissions in the production of goods and services to the end user. And in the national accounts, we have households as end users or consumers, we have the government, and we have investment. Investment are things that are not used up in the same year and basically become part of the infrastructure and the capital goods that are used in later years. And what we see here is that households are really important. They're the main demand category, and that within households we have the categories of shelter, of food, of mobility, that are really important, but you also see that there's manufactured goods and services that come in. The construction sector is under investment. Most of the government consists of services. If you forward one, if you draw this is a whole set of countries that was included in this calculation, and so if you draw a regression line through their GDP or expenditure per capita, you see that carbon footprints are going up with increased wealth levels, but that the importance changes of the different consumption activities. So for poor countries and poor people, food is the most important expenditure item, and it's also the largest contribution to carbon footprint. Then shelter is always important. It used to be actually in the US for quite a while the most important cause of emissions, and that's mostly household energy consumption. And then as you become richer, it's mobility that becomes the leading cause of emissions, followed by manufactured products. Next slide, please. Now I did the calculation that we have from the newest US input-output table. Here we have an assumption of, the assumption is that the imports are basically treated as if they were produced domestically. And the US is an exception among industrialized countries in that the direct energy consumption of households, the direct and the fuel combustion in vehicles are really important. In most other industrialized countries, the purchases of products are much more important relative to those two items. But food is a category where we have just very high greenhouse gas emissions. Now this is all US households taken together in the year 2012. And so just the food consumption alone in the US is more than a gigaton of CO2 emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions. And it's more important than electricity, right? If we look at the shelter category, in addition to electricity and fuel consumption in the household, of course we have the building itself. And so the building also requires building materials. And if they are steel and cement, for example, then there are substantial emissions associated with that. For transport, of course, we have the gasoline, but then we also have the vehicle, and we have other forms of transport like buses and trains and planes as transport services indicated here, that also come into the picture. for the service sector, so what we did in this calculation here is that we included all the buildings and other capital that is needed to provide the services, and assign them to the various final demand categories. And so you can actually see that services in total are quite important. And within the services, health care is the single most important sector. Next slide, please. There's this very nice website that UC Berkeley has put together. It's the CoolClimate Network, and they have a household calculator. So I've put Nashville, Tennessee in there. I sort of thought this was this, single postdoc, and so the estimate from this website, with nothing else adjusted, we see that there's 30 tons of CO2 equivalent per year that is estimated, and you can see exactly those categories that I talked about being important. Next slide, please. So we actually looked at these and thought, well, what can we do to investigate options to reduce emissions? And this is work that was led by Richard Wood at NTNU, and basically looks at the various phases of the life cycle, from production through distribution, acquisition, use, to disposal, and what are the different options to reduce emissions in each of those life cycle stages. And then we went to life cycle assessments of these options and basically tried to estimate what are the reductions if the option is implemented, and what's the likelihood of the option being implemented. And so as an example here, I'm showing the example of shifting away from red meat, that's the low carbon meat, or adopting a vegetarian diet. And so we see done throughout the European Union by half of the people. That was the assumption, that half of the people would adopt those behavioral changes. And we included the rebound effect. The rebound here is that we assumed that the money that is saved if you go buy cheaper pork than more expensive beef, that you would spend that on something else, and you can see that that slightly reduces the savings that can be obtained. If you add up all the potential with the rebound effect, we estimate that that would amount to a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by a quarter within the carbon footprint of households in the EU. And there are, so I'm now at, I hope you're following me, I'm at slide 9. So you can split this up and investigate actually different types of actions here that we have looked at. What do they do? Changes in consumption patterns, lifetime extensions for products, those sort of types of actions, that's on the left. Which phase of the product they address, that's in the middle. Most of them address the use phase, some of them address production, some of them try to reduce demand. And on the right-hand side, what kind of products are being addressed. So most of the measures, or most of the most effective measures, address transport, followed by food and buildings. And so that was a finding for the EU. If we go to slide 10, I think the situation in the US will be different. The main difference between the US and Europe is that there's a much higher direct energy use in US households that is tied to larger vehicles and longer driving distances and less efficient building envelopes and heating and cooling systems. And so I expect that in the US, still the largest reduction opportunities are within the direct energy use, direct transportation use sort of category. And I've written down a few of the steps that obviously you have already investigated in the Wedge paper. But apart from that, it seems like this issue of food consumption, obviously getting away from red meat and dairy products, that would be quite effective. Reducing food waste is something I haven't listed here, but that's obvious that we know that there's significant amounts of food waste, and if we can reduce those, that would have a large impact. And the final item that I think is important to consider is that for all these manufactured products that we are buying, that it matters a lot where they are produced and how they are produced. How efficient are the factories that produce the products, and what are the energy sources with which the production of the products is achieved. And so if the efficiencies can increase and there is a cleaner energy mix, then you can actually have significant benefits from that. So that's the points I had prepared. So slide 11. And I'm happy if you get in touch with me on Twitter or by email. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Edgar. Maybe we can leave time for a couple of questions.
Yes.
Do we have some questions? My sense was that there was so much information presented here, I couldn't keep up with it. And
Oh, sorry.
I would like to get another look at the slides and start to think about where we can build from here. But Janet?
Yeah, so I'm trying to make a connection just between all this work and some of what you just said and the work on Project Drawdown. Do you know that Drawdown work? Mm-hmm. See, okay, so I'm trying to see if there's any link because they have a whole list of behavioral recommendations across domains that are very much, a lot of them are indirect. And I just remember like composting was something to be done and it was indirect. And so a lot of those, so I'm just trying to think if there's any connection between them.
Well, I've seen a lot of things in the popular literature about what you can do that's indirect, and I have no sense that it's based on analysis of the technical potential.
Yeah, the drawdown book, each end of each chapter, it talks about how much CO2 would be accomplished by a whole range of behaviors, and it's something that at Penn State, the engineering department has set up a whole set of research programs to have people pick which drawdown thing they want to do. And I think that some of them I would consider to be, I was just kind of looking them up, would be indirect.
We're going to show some slides on that tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, one more question.
Very quickly, the consortium has created knowledge products that point to particular hotspots and life cycles for 104 product categories and best practices. So to provide guidance, it's really aimed more at buyers and suppliers than end consumers, but our ultimate goal is to provide that kind of information to consumers. Technical potential as well as other things.
Yeah, following up on that, and this is something I don't think there's going to be an opportunity to answer, but I'm just going to put my marker out there that I'm probably going to want to follow up with people on, is at Vanderbilt we're trying to do a life cycle inventory of the environmental impact of food waste and also food procurement, and it's, as many know, it's awfully hard to get information. So if there's both, Edgar, I'm going to follow up with you, and if there's others who have expertise in how to take our procurement and figure out where the biggest technical potential is for reducing our university's environmental impact by reducing waste and thinking about procurement. That's something we're working on.
Okay, let's move on. Do we have Diana here, and do we have your presentation?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Diana. Would you?
I have Diana's slide deck, so I can do the same thing as we did for Edgar, and I can move along with Diana's PDFs.
Okay, Diana, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, just a second. I'll try to share my screen as well, so I have the presentation here as well. Sorry, really bad at multitasking.
We're having some slight Skype difficulties with the video feed. We can hear you just fine. We just we're having trouble displaying the Skype video.
Okay, that's fine. Then, sure. So, hi everyone. As Edgar said, I did my PhD in Norway. He was my supervisor, and my PhD was on an environmental impacts embodied in household consumption. So I've looked a lot into carbon footprints and in various consumption domains, and since December I've been working as a research fellow in the University of Leeds. And today my task was to present an overview of what is the technical potential in the transport sector, and I'll just be scratching the surface. I didn't even try to list all of the different options that there may be in the transport sector, as I imagine those would be very different and a lot, but I'd like to give you some examples. So if we go to the first slide, here again, a similar slide to what Edgar showed. It's showing the U.S. household carbon footprint for 2011, and you can see that the transport. So I'm looking at land-based transport and air-based transport together constitute to about 35% of the household carbon footprint in the U.S. So that's very significant, and it's actually the most important consumption category from all of the ones that we're looking into. Land travel is currently a much bigger one. Air travel is one that is growing fast, especially among richer consumers. I could talk a bit about that later. And the majority of transport impacts are direct emissions. That means that they occur in the use phase of products. These are tailpipe emissions as people drive their private cars. And you could see it is about 70% of land travel that is direct, and the majority really of air travel is indirect, as not many people have private jets and they generally purchase that service. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that Edgar showed already, so I'm not going to go into it again, but I just wanted to point to, from the portfolio of improvement options that they have looked into in that paper, again, you see that transport contributes to about 40% of the potential savings. So transport really is the category that stands out a lot as having very high improvement potential on the demand side. Next slide, please. It is also the most carbon intensive category. Again, you could compare air travel and land travel, and they stand out with above 3 kilograms CO2 equivalents per US dollar. So even though people currently don't spend as much on these services, so you could see them on the left side of the expenditure axis, this is the x-axis, where you have annual expenditure in US dollars per capita. Even though people don't spend as much, these are very carbon intensive. So altogether, the total carbon footprint associated with that sector is very important. Next slide, please. As I said, these categories are also very elastic. So here's a comparison. This is micro data. So these are household. Each point is a different household in Europe. These are European results, but the results generally hold across wealthy nations, at least. And you could see that the line, the regression line representing food is very flat, while land and air travel behave very differently. They're very elastic. So as people become richer or they spend more, there is a disproportionate amount of spending that is shifted towards land travel and especially air travel. So we could really foresee these categories becoming more and more important in the future. The regression, the elasticities that are communicated on the right side again point to the same thing, that across all the categories, these are the most elastic one, and that is really worldwide data that we have.
Clarification. Is
Yes.
this elasticity with respect to household income?
No, these are expenditure elasticity. So as total expenditure increases, how would expenditure in land-based transport and air-based transport change? So similar trend you see with income, very similar. It's just you don't account for savings here and how savings are spent. Next slide, please. So here I'd like to start getting into the technical potential of different activities, and that is a figure from a paper that we published last year, again on EU regions. And on that figure, you could already see that there is huge technical potential with regards to shifting from one transport mode to another. So on the top part of the figure, you have again the carbon intensity on the right side, on the y-axis, and annual distance. So this is in kilometers per capita on the x-axis. And you could see that an average European travels by land for about 9,500 kilometers a year. Sorry, I didn't think to translate those into miles, but yeah, I hope that you're getting the picture. And you could see that as you shift from one transport to another, there would be a substantial, there's a potential for substantial reduction in carbon intensity. For example, if you shift from car travel, which is currently around 200 grams CO2 per kilometer, shifting to walking or biking is at around 3 grams CO2 per kilometer. So there would be a huge reduction in carbon footprint. Also, you could see on the figure that air travel has substantial carbon intensity, higher than car travel even. And when it comes to air travel, currently in our sample, it was only 40% of the sample that were flyers that had flown during the year, and we still see that the carbon footprint of air travel is quite substantial compared to land travel. It's even higher. It's about 2.4 tons CO2 equivalents per capita, while land travel is about 1.5 tons CO2. The area, sorry, I forgot to say, the area of each rectangle shows the total carbon footprint that is associated with that activity, and the percentage shows the proportion from the total carbon footprint. Next slide, please. So in terms of efficiency of car versus air travel, a common claim that is made by industry is that flying is more efficient, and there's quite some literature that has tried to debunk these myths, because usually, or sometimes, it happens that comparisons are made with small cars, which disregards general trends in the population. This is vehicles trends in the US across time, and you could see that there has been quite substantial increase in SUVs, CUVs, and really large cars that would be much more carbon intensive per kilometer of travel. This is actually, there's a similar trend in Europe as well, maybe not as striking, but apparently there's prognosis that by 2020 there will be as much as 30% of car sales will be SUVs. Such claims also don't often disregard occupancy rates, as long travel by land is typically associated with higher occupancy rates, and ignores short-lived climate forcers. So that's important to note, that even though planes may maybe in some cases more fuel efficient per kilometer, because the emissions happen in the upper layer of in upper layer of the atmosphere. They're actually more harmful than emissions that occur on land, on the Earth's surface. Next slide, please. So another thing that I already briefly mentioned, occupancy really matters, and these are again figures that show differences in carbon intensity across different across different transport modes, also showing the variability in intensities. And you could see the difference between the figures is in the occupancy rate. The one on the right shows the average occupancy, where you have much higher carbon intensities compared to what is often assumed in claims 100% occupancy. Next slide, please. So here I wanted to compare, or I wanted to point to again the importance of fuel and car characteristics for the technical potential. You can see a comparison of different cars, types of car, from city car to a large car, and you could see the general progression in carbon intensity per kilometer, regardless of the fuel. So shifting to smaller cars has a great potential to reduce emissions, or a great technical potential. And then again, shifting to a different fuel holds great potential. Here we have electric cars as the least carbon intensive. Of course, this is something that is hugely dependent on the carbon intensity mix of the country. These are EU average results. Next slide, please. I just wanted to finish on a note that there's a body of evidence showing that technological improvements have been offset by various human factors, and showing that as transport mode changes or efficiency changes, behavior changes as well. So again, that's something to lead to the discussions that you'll be having later on. But something related to the work presented here is that we noted that, for example, as distance increases, as travel distance increases, the likelihood of people driving it increases a lot as well. So distance matters as well. Thank you very much. And the next slide, please. I just wanted to share a link of where I have the presentation slide, so you're welcome to download it or email me with questions, or yes, and any comments are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm thinking that maybe we got a late start, but let's hold the questions until the end, and let's move on to Christian, if you're there.
Yes.
So, I know, Christian, I was on video. Do you mind if I just disconnect the call real quick and then reinitiate the call to get the Skype back in action?
No, that's totally fine.
Okay, just 1 second.
While we're doing that, let me just say that that Christian is a doctoral student at University of Copenhagen, and he spent the fall here with us, and was just a huge contributor, and I think has interacted now and networked with a lot of the people in the room as well. But for a doctoral student, I thought he showed just remarkable initiative to contact me out of the blue to participate and organize a conference in Copenhagen late August, that many of you went to. And he's really got a lot of momentum behind him.
So I still haven't connected. The Skype just won't respond. So, all right, Christian, can you give us 2 minutes. I'm going to just restart, and then I'll call you right back.
Totally fine. Go ahead.
All right, can everyone hear us?
Yes.
Okay. So let me get you all on the full screen, and we'll continue. All right. So I believe someone is sharing their screen. Is Christian, are you sharing your screen right now?
Can you see me? Can you see the slides now?
Yes, we can now.
We can see you.
Okay. So I could hear the mic sort of. Sorry?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So I'll just start. I heard that Mike sort of introduced me already. I can say that I'm a PhD student, 2 months away from finishing my dissertation. My main research is on the interaction between climate change mitigation and behavior change. So really looking at the specifics of behavior change process. And there I focus on self-control, self-regulation, and in their role in the behavior change process. And I've been trying to reach out to researchers from other disciplines, and what I'm going to present today is also some work from that. And I was sort of tasked to look into food consumption. I know Edgar and Diana already shared some insights, but I'll just present some general overview of the impact of food and why it matters from a climate change perspective, but also other environmental impacts that are really less discussed, at least in psychology, like land use change, biodiversity, but also many other impacts. I won't really go into detail, but I think it's important to note is that it also matters for other important environmental and biological systems. And there was a recent study in Science that sort of did a meta-analysis of food and the LCA studies related to that. And they found that 26% of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are related to the food supply chain. And this is what I'm going to speak about today. But I also just want to, before going into the details of the study, just mention that there's a recent paper in Nature Climate Change sort of drawing on the similar method that Shasleen Sari presented earlier. But they showed basically that US consumers underestimated the impact or the greenhouse gas emissions associated with foods, and especially in comparison with other energy, electricity. And Mike and I, we did a short, I guess, promotional article on that, recent article. But I can tell you about it later if you want to know more. And so basically what the study I'll present today actually looks at 4 different domains, but I'm going to focus on the food part. And this is a study that I've been working on for a while. So it's Paul, an environmental engineer from the Danish Technical University, recently recruited Diana for the paper as well, so that's great, and my supervisor. But I think what I'm going to focus on today, and we really came from sort of a basic standing that I want to know what food behaviors matter, but both in terms of its the greenhouse gas emissions associated with buying a kilogram of something, but also to what extent are they consumed. And to sort of answer that question, we looked into 7 different European countries, and I will show them in a graph later. So what I'm presenting is basically a life cycle assessment analysis, and quite a descriptive one. Differs from what Diana and Edgar presented, where they input-output models with liquid impacts to monetary expenditure. And this one is more on a unit flow, in this case a kilogram of a type of food. To sort of do this type of analysis, we employed a data matching procedure where we looked into Eurostat, which holds a bunch of different consumption data on how much of different types of foods are consumed. And then we tried to couple and match that with what was in a typically used, widely used life cycle assessment inventory, in this case, EcoInvent. And some data matching procedure meant that we couldn't include all types of food, but I think we have some of the important. I'll just mention which ones are excluded a bit later. But it's also, we allocate impact on an individual per capita level, and we did that by using multiplier, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions associated with 1 kilogram of a food type, and then couple that and multiplied it by the consumption level. Just before I go into the results, I think it's important again to speak that I'm only talking about here farm stage emissions. So it's only the emissions associated with producing 1 kilogram of red meat, for example. And the meat analysis I talked about before by Poor and Nemechek in Science, they estimated that this part of the life cycle is responsible for 61% of total food emissions. And if you couple in or factor in deforestation effects, that'll be 81. But still, this type of analysis ignores retail, consumer transport, and cooking and food waste, both in the production, but also at the consumption stage. And the multipliers that we use are global averages. So in principle, they do relate to consumers in the US. Again, we find quite significant differences between farms, both within and between countries, but we can't really address that. But I suggest if you want to know more about that, then again, the meat analysis in the supplemental material has excellent data on that. Coming back to the study and what types of foods were included, we had 4 types of meat. I think the most impactful ones, pork, poultry, bovine, or meat, and modern, that would be lamb, goat. And then we can speak about cow milk, 8 types of cereals, and then 6 types of fruit. And the notable exclusions here are fish and vegetables. Especially the former is probably more responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, but I'll refer to Diana and Edgar maybe to elaborate on that. And just to give you an example of the multipliers we used, modern in this case found to be the most impactful, 38 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of modern. So you can also see that this is far outranks any type of cereal or fruit, but also the other types of meat, like poultry. Just to give you here a general overview between the countries, when we factor in the different multipliers and the consumption levels, they actually look quite homogeneous between countries, especially also between the different categories, with the exclusion of Poland, which is a unique case, but also maybe less developed than some of the other countries, or just different types of consumption pattern. But then when we zoom in, I'm going to zoom in on the meat part, you show that what looks marginal is not necessarily the case. The composition of what's consumed in terms of different types of meat varies extensively between the countries. Like in Poland, it's mainly pork that we consume, whereas the distribution looks more varied in other types of countries. In Denmark, for example, bovine is very popular. But modern is not really a thing that you eat that often, whereas in Norway that's not the case. And I think these nuances are important from a TP perspective to really not only look at the multipliers of what's the specific product's carbon sensitive, but also to what extent are they consumed a lot. So it sort of adds a layer to a shortness paper. It's at least it's my view. And just because we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to go into more details, but I want to have a few concluding remarks. And I think this study, but also the supplemental material, can inform peer researchers and policymakers, or peer researchers like myself, who are interested in knowing what types of behavior matter, how do they differ, and ones matter between countries. And even within countries, they do differ quite a bit. And both in terms of the multiplier, also in the consumption patterns. And again, coming back to the caveats that I mentioned earlier, our analysis really underestimates food emissions. Yet, if I go back, you still see quite a significant emissions coming from food, especially when we look towards 2030 and 2050 and factor in the emissions reductions required to stay sort of in line with the Paris goals. Then almost where we need to go to in 2050 to reach 2-degree targets are just emitted already from the food domain. I think that's an important factor to consider. And I sort of added the slides quite late in the development process, but I think a next step for future research around this topic could be to, I was also mentioned in session 2, to really look at individual differences, both in the consumption pattern, but also in the carbon footprint, because that also relates to which individuals to target and most relevant to target in an intervention. And then, but also coming back to what I presented earlier, the food impact of kinds of environmental impacts, and I think considering these when we develop studies and decide which behaviors to focus on should also weigh in. And then that links to the last point I want to make is to really add a layer of interactiveness between greenhouse gas emissions and land use transformation, biodiversity. And I think reaching out to the community around integrated assessment models could be one step forward. Last week I was in Utrecht and had several conversations with Detlef van Voeren, which I know some of you know quite well, Edgar included. And he's one of the leading professors around integrated assessment models. And they're really sort of in the dark around behaviors and how to improve the models around the behavioral assumptions that are implicit in sort of the economic assumptions around behavior. So I think there's some important work to be done here. And I think that will be it. So thank you.
Thank you, Christian. I think we need to move quickly along to Ash, and Ash is here, so maybe we will not have the technical difficulties.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ash Gillis. I'm a graduate student at Penn State in social psychology. I work there with Janet Swam. I've previously done work with Heather Truelove. I did my master's there at University of North Florida. And I guess that's who I am, what I'm doing. So I'm going to change topics a little bit and talk more about behavioral plasticity. And I want to thank our previous panelists in bringing our attention to the technical potential, because those quantifications are important, and I couldn't do it, so I'm glad someone is doing it. So in terms of behavioral plasticity of indirect effects, where I wanted to start was by giving a bit of an overview about what that really means. And a lot of this will probably be repetitive with some of the previous panelists. And a theme that I'm going to take throughout this whole talk will be the importance of people in context. And try to consider that in a framework for how we're understanding behavioral plasticity in regard to direct effects and indirect effects. So, let's see. So indirect effects, just for those who haven't quite gotten what this really means, energy consumption and carbon emissions that occur during the production or transport phases of the life cycle. And so it's inherent that this is from the perspective of the consumer, right? So we're thinking that the consumer behavior is the direct impact. The indirect effects are the effects that happen before the consumption takes place. So what is indirect to the consumer can be direct to someone else. And so that's something that I just want to kind of pull forward and thinking about as we're considering how to assess behavioral plasticity. And as Edgar said, that consumers can influence emissions across the supply chain. And I find this figure that Edgar showed to be helpful in thinking about how that's possible. So typically, behavioral scientists are mostly concerned with behavior that's happening in the use phase, direct energy use, and that was the main focus of the original behavioral Wedge paper. And we can think of a lot of different ways that consumers can affect greenhouse gas emissions by decisions that affect these different stages of the life cycle process. So in their selection of products, and what they do after they consume products and the like. So some examples of behaviors that have high technical potential for indirect effects. We've talked a lot about food and transportation. So those are key. One that we haven't talked too much about that I think might be a bit more difficult to calculate other than as opposed to a specific product that's manufactured and distributed, are services. So utilities, in the States at least, many people have the option for who they choose, what companies they choose their energy to come from. And so you can have a choice for choosing renewable energy or choosing energy that comes from a company that uses coal-fired power plants. And so these have built-in indirect effects. Landscaping is another one that has a lot of indirect effects. Landscapes at the household level, in the farming industry, can act as carbon sinks and help to actually offset many of our direct carbon emissions. And many people, especially in the United States, outsource this service. They hire landscape professionals to deal with this for them. Or the choices for what their landscape looks like is dictated by builders, by landscape architects, et cetera. So there's a lot of built-in emissions and environmental effects that occur at this level. So these are some of the areas that might be worth considering. In thinking about behavioral plasticity, I sort of preaching to the choir and saying that it's difficult to assess and calculate. And so a functional framework could be helpful in aggregating and disaggregating, as Tom mentioned earlier, these estimates. And so when I was thinking about this, there are many different influences for behavioral plasticity that we might want to consider when trying to make these estimates, especially for indirect effects. So typically we're thinking about the behavior. And Janet talked a little bit about this, and Alex as well, that different behaviors can have different behavioral plasticities, obviously. But it also, the context matters. And the person, who is it that is engaging in these behaviors? And so I'll kind of go into these a little bit more in more detail. So with the behavior, this is the one that we'll be most familiar with. So different behaviors have different plasticity, and it also depends on how you change the behavior. So different intervention strategies for the same behavior can have different plasticity estimates. And so those are important things to consider. For the context, our estimates for behavioral plasticity are inherently couched within the time scale that we're looking at and that we're measuring within. So when does the behavior change occur? When are we measuring it? And to what over time, to what extent are we considering the potential for rebound effects and the like? And where this behavior occurs. And so we've, as mentioned, the original behavioral wedge paper is exclusive to the United States. So it's important to consider geographical context as well as a social context, which I think Kim was getting a little bit into this, that we have to consider the decision-making, the real-world decision-making process that people are going through in making these changes, and how does the behavior change fit within that day-to-day for people. And then speaking of people, who are the people? So this one I'll kind of go a little bit into more detail. So this is kind of a theme that has been coming up throughout today is, who are we talking about? And so from a consumer's perspective, what is high impact to experts is costly and socially or structurally disincentivized to consumers. And so behaviors like reducing meat consumption, changing your transportation operations, buying fuel-efficient vehicles, landscaping, these have high technical potential, but potentially also low behavioral plasticity because of their costliness and the social context surrounding these behaviors. So kind of in short, it depends on who the who is, and different types of consumers may respond to interventions differently. And as we move forward, it would be helpful to think about what kinds of consumers we're thinking about, and talking about subgroups, and many of the presentations looking at different social identity groups, gender, race, socioeconomic status, all of these things are important to consider. And there may also be other techniques that we can employ to understand subgroups of people who may respond to interventions. So some of those tools that I just wanted to highlight from the behavioral sciences, a different kind of LCA, not a life cycle analysis, but a latent class analysis to identify classes of people who may respond more or less to particular interventions for certain behaviors, or other types of segmentation techniques that the marketing industry utilizes for advertising. When doing our program evaluation, well, I guess one thing is we need more evaluation, period. But in doing program evaluation, taking a multi-level perspective to try and understand how behavior changes within the social context. So taking a multi-level approach to how we assess change over time, I think would help to disaggregate things a little bit and help us understand how plastic are these behaviors, for whom, and in what circumstances. And as opposed to direct use behaviors where it's a consumer doing one thing or one person doing one thing, with indirect behaviors, we're incorporating many different actors in. Now we've got people in acquisition, in production, in distribution, in sales, many different stakeholders involved in this process. And so if we want to think about the behavioral plasticity of these behaviors that have many actors involved, stakeholder analyses might be a good way to go. Or having workshops like this where we have many different perspectives represented are also really helpful to try and understand the different perspectives. So that is all I have, basically just to try and provide a framework for discussion, that behavioral plasticity depends on what the behavior is, how we approach behavior change, who are involved in behavior change, like who the targets are, when change occurs, and where the change fits within the social context. Thanks.
We're stuck at the end and we're running behind time, but it's yours to do.
All right, so what I'll be talking to you a little bit today is to dig into the particular behavior of food choices, which, as we just learned, is a pretty substantial behavior decision that we make on a daily basis. It looks like from the numbers I was just seeing from earlier presentations, accounts for around a quarter of total greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm not going to present to you any of my data. What I'll talk to you about is a new project that my great collaborators that you're seeing here on this slide and I have been trying to launch, where we're thinking about adoption decisions of emergent food technology. But in the process of developing a grant proposal that's now under review, we looked pretty closely at the literature to try to understand how food choices have evolved or changed over time and some emergent trends in those choices. And so what I'd like to do is just sort of point out a few of the interesting, I think, patterns that we were seeing in this literature that might affect the way we think about targeting food behavior in the coming years. So just very quickly, I think this is probably obvious to most people in this room, but Americans eat a lot of meat. We're very intense meat eaters. We're in terms of per capita meat consumption per year, we eat more than any other country in the world, aside from Australia, and about 10 to 15 kilograms per person more than Western Europe. And interestingly, you can see the lowest, I don't know if this has, the lowest meat-consuming region of the world is South Asia, which is certainly a function to some degree in low income, but also the cultural and moral beliefs around food and eating animals there. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think might be some emerging trends on shifting moral understandings of food behavior in the United States, and I think sort of thinking about it as a moral choice is important in this conversation. We've seen similar figures like this today, and we see this in food as well. This is an interesting recent study that's looking at the carbon intensity of food behaviors. It's plotting the carbon dioxide equivalents per 1,000 kilocalories consumed in the United States, and the quintiles associated with that distribution. What you see is that the top quintile, top 20% most carbon-intensive Americans, in terms of their diets, are accounting for about 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions associated with food production. So we have this very high impact food-consuming group in the United States. Interestingly, though, I think that if you look at who those people are, they tend to be disproportionately older, whiter, and more rural. More male. So at least some of those demographic patterns are beginning to sort of age out in terms of the U.S. demographic distribution. And so I do think we're sort of beginning to see a little bit of a generational change in food patterns of food choices. We are now beginning to see a little bit of a transition to leaner and greener meat consumption. So overall, meat consumption in the United States has not shifted by any meaningful, well, it's risen a little bit, but it hasn't declined since the 1970s. There was some question in around 2010 to 2015 if we were beginning to see a peak in total meat consumption in the United States. And the more recent data that's coming out, as you can see in the right-hand side of this figure, I don't know if you can see my pointer there, is that was probably an effect of the recession and a reaction to lower real incomes during the period of the recession. So meat consumption has rebounded, but what we do see is that the kinds of meat that people are consuming have been shifting. So people are now eating significantly less beef than they used to. We've seen about a 20% reduction in per capita beef consumption and about a doubling of poultry consumption over the last several decades. And this has certainly led to a reduction in total carbon emissions associated with the American diet. So this is just one sliver of an analysis. The NRDC recently released this report that tried to quantify the emissions that were avoided because of these dietary changes. You can see that's one figure there, about 270 million metric tons. They do not consider rebound effects, and so this is probably likely an overestimate associated with that 10-year period. But nonetheless, you're beginning to see some reduction in environmental impacts associated with these dietary shifts. Importantly, these are primarily health related. So if you ask people why they've shifted away from red meat to other kinds of meats, it's largely because they're concerned about cardiovascular health. Cost is a reason that's commonly cited, most commonly during that recession period. If you look at the other kinds of reasons that were mentioned outside of that 5-year period right after the recession, you see health rise to the top consistently. If you look at the kinds of reasons why people are making these choices today compared to back in the 80s, environment is becoming more prevalently mentioned. So I think environment is rising more and more in public consciousness, but as you can see by this figure, it still remains relatively low in the list of concerns for why people are making these kinds of dietary choices. But I do think there's one interesting pattern here that is one of the more intriguing findings for me looking at this literature is the generational effect. So this is another figure that takes that original distribution graph I showed you earlier with respect to the quintiles and carbon intensity, and here I'm showing you how different age groups in the United States fall within those quintiles. So 18 to 29-year-olds relative to their proportion in the population are about 4% more likely to be eating low carbon, the lowest carbon diets. Compare that to the over 65-year-olds and over 50-year-olds who are 2% more likely to be in the highest carbon diets. If you ask young Americans the reasons why they're making these dietary choices differently than the other age groups that I'm showing you up here, they tend to more often mention moral considerations and the environment. So this is a generation that I think for the first time, at least from what we can tell by longitudinal data in this area, are thinking about their food choices as moral choices, and especially because of their environmental footprint. And so I wonder if this is a real opportunity in terms of the way we approach talking about food and targeting food-related behaviors. So a few thoughts in terms of looking forward. I think it's important to recognize that dietary change, and especially red meat consumption, has been a major target of public health interventions over the last several decades. So if we're thinking about behavioral plasticity and the extent to which we can expect behavioral responses to interventions, this has been a highly targeted behavior. We have seen pretty significant shifts in movement away from red meat, but I would argue, and I think just looking at various data sources, that this is to a large degree a function of raising awareness coming out of public health and the medical communities to try to bring attention to this kind of thing. And so we ought to know as we approach this is not an untouched behavior. This is a behavior that has been targeted quite a lot, and there's been a lot of change already that's been eked out of these kinds of decisions. In addition, note that adherence to diet interventions is extremely low. If you look in the behavioral medicine and public health literatures, there's just infinite number of papers written about the adherence problem and how hard it is to get people to consistently stick to these kinds of dietary behavior changes. So in terms of behavioral plasticity, I think we need to be realistic about what changes in diet can actually deliver. But as I said before, I think some of these intergenerational shifts and norms are pretty interesting and may represent, and there's always a question with generational effects as to whether people age out of these patterns or if they're going to take them with the generation as a cohort-based effect. And so I think that's a question that will be interesting to follow. A couple very quick points. I think as one of our other panelists mentioned, I think we need to be giving more attention to food waste. This is a recent paper by Birney and colleagues that's just showing you that about a third of all meat and dairy products is wasted. About a third of greenhouse gas emissions could be avoided if we were to shrink or essentially eliminate the food waste. I know that's not obviously possible, but there's a lot of opportunity to reduce emissions associated with more efficient use of food, and also something that might be a little bit more, where we might see a little more malleability in terms of behavioral uptake. And finally, the whole kind of idea that launched this collaboration that I spoke briefly about in the beginning is to try to understand how emergent food technology could change the landscape in terms of food-related emissions. So you might have been hearing about in vitro meat, cultured meat, lab-grown meat, various names. The industry likes to call it clean meat for marketing purposes. It's coming. We're expecting that some of the earliest products may arrive on the market this year, this calendar year. It's getting a lot more attention, and it has the potential. It's always unclear how big these impacts will be from new technologies, but it has the potential to reduce land and water consumption by as much as 90% or more, and GHG emissions possibly in the similar kind of range. But it's all going to depend on to what extent the public accepts and is willing to try these kinds of products. There are a lot of lessons we can learn from I think, underperformance of genetically modified food technologies and how they've played out in the United States. And again, I just want to revisit very quickly this idea of food as morality. And so there's a recent paper that sort of did a kind of a post-mortem on the GMO, the transition towards GMOs and the lack of uptake of GMO-related foods. And there they find that scientists, engineers, experts were consistently talking about GMOs as a risk-benefit decision, convincing people that risks are relatively small, benefits may be large. If you actually look at the way people were making these decisions about GMOs, and particularly whether to support or reject them in terms of policy discussions, they approach this as a moral decision. And so trying to convince a person about risks and benefits when they're approaching this through a moral frame, what's right and wrong, is just, it's completely out of sync. Right? And so what we know is that people tend to really be uncomfortable with human interference within nature, and particularly plants and animals. The general public is more comfortable with cloning and growing organs in laboratories than they are of cloning and growing human tissue, animal tissue. So there's something about interrupting natural processes, non-human natural processes, that people are particularly uncomfortable with. So I'd like to see the field get ahead of this. This could be a really high-impact potential game changer. I'd like to see the field get ahead of this and think about these kinds of issues, and not, make the same kinds of mistakes that we've made consistently with nuclear, with GMOs, with other kinds of technology. So that's my one soapbox point. And so yeah, that's all I have to, and thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Amanda. Mike and Jonathan, how much time do we have? We're really running late.
We've got a race scheduled at 3.
You have 30 minutes.
Okay?
I know we're going to have 2 hours.
Okay. Okay.
Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of a specific question and a comment. So one question I have is, when you were showing Amanda not Amanda, but the graph with the decrease in cows, I guess, and chickens, is there actually fewer cows around, or is it that there's a decrease in the production?
That's a great question. I wanted to talk a little bit about the global context here, but there's just not enough time. But we're actually, an important point here that we need to be thinking about with respect to U.S. emissions is that exports are playing a larger role in our livestock industry. So I don't know if there's a reduction in total, cow livestock, but we are exporting a larger proportion of what we produce in the United States. So some of that is not a reduction in production, but it's just being offset by the fact it's being exported out of the country.
Right. So my other question is related to this. Thinking about psychologically, and when I was struck with the technical potential that I think was Christian talked about, didn't include the use part of meat. So it wasn't cooking, it wasn't that part, it was everything beforehand. And then I was thinking about it when Ash was talking about like stakeholders and who all is involved in that reduction and what are we trying to change. So is this like a collective action thing that we want to change our behaviors so people down the pipeline change their behaviors? And then from a point of view of the user, it seems like there's a fair amount of diffusion of responsibility, that these things are happening somewhere else, and somebody else has to make the decisions about production. I'm just buying stuff. And so that seems to be something that would be important to be thinking about. And also psychologically, I was thinking about in terms of beliefs about meat consumption. So it's not just switching from poultry to meat, but this moral issue about it is that the 4 N's about meat consumption, I don't know if you know those, that it's, people believe that it's necessary, that it's normal. It's necessary, normal, nice, and natural. And for all of those things, and if you want to get somebody to change their behaviors, you have to convince them it's not one of those 4 things. And ethically, in the moral part of it, those are actually the same reasons people have given for slavery. And so to make that sort of connection between their treatment of meat and the moral issues and the beliefs that are underpinning the decisions people are making about food are not likely to be about carbon dioxide and things like that.
Just a comment on that before we go back to questions. The food example is a good. Am I on now? Yeah, okay. The food example is a good example for raising the question of whose behavior is the target. Some of this has been talking about household choices, but given that most of the impact of food of the food life cycle is upstream of the household, and a noticeable amount of it is downstream of the household, then the question is, whose behavior needs to be plastic? And of course, there's possibilities all along the stream. So psychologists tend to think about consumer behavior with food just as we do with energy. But as we get into the discussion later in the workshop, I hope we will be looking at other actors in the life cycle and their behavioral plasticity.
So my question is about the government subsidize the meat. Like American government subsidize like $38 billion each year, and then the meat is much more cheaper here than Asia and in Europe. So that could be another factors that in terms of the policy-wise. And then also, like for example, some vegetable is just the same price per pound than like chicken breast. Asparagus is the same price as chicken breast. So I think a lot of has to be looking at the policy level as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you can see that, there's obviously more sophisticated analysis, but meat consumption is responsive to some degree to price, as you can see by what we just showed. And I think one of the reasons why poultry has expanded so much is because the cost of poultry has actually declined quite a bit over that time period, far more so than the cost of beef. So I think part of that effect, it's certainly, as you saw, health and cost are the two main drivers, and I think you're seeing the consequences of that.
I can speak loud. Do we know the carbon intensity difference between lab-grown meats and traditional meat, or is that not widely produced enough to see that carbon intensity?
It's a good question. It's not widely known yet. There's been several LCAs that have been performed, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. A lot of it's going to depend on decarbonization of the energy supply, because it's an energy-intensive process. It doesn't require land, though, and most of the emissions associated with meat production are in land use, I believe. Someone correct me if I'm wrong on that, but a pretty significant chunk is land use. So obviously you're avoiding the land, and that land could be possibly put to more productive uses in terms of carbon storage. But I think it certainly is promising in terms of large reductions, but there's a lot of questions about how the sort of energy system is going to evolve over time, and other kinds of trade-offs that are being made.
With respect to your comments about morality versus risk-benefit, I think were especially prescient. We did a project with the dairy industry years ago to try and reduce carbon footprint of dairy, and made some really good progress. But one of the best technologies available for doing that was BST. It was a bovine somatotropin, which increases yield, which is the single best thing you can do it. But that's one of the things that consumers refuse to accept for largely irrational reasons. I'm wondering, do you have any ideas on how we can get ahead of those morality issues in ways that are not just benign, but actually retard progress on some of these really important?
You raised to me what I think is one of the most interesting conundrums in this, because I do think there's a lot of promise. I, in general, think that we are missing an opportunity to moralize environmental behaviors more. People are more responsive a lot of times to the moral consequences of their actions than they are to price. Not to say that obviously you need price for things to get done, and oftentimes finances are a limiting factor in being able to adopt certain behaviors, but we're more concerned about children being in the hospital with asthma than we are about saving a few dollars in transportation costs, for example. But here's the challenge, and I think that the kinds of moral considerations that are driving, I think, especially millennials to avoid red meat, are oftentimes the same moral considerations that are causing them to be concerned about GMOs. They want natural food systems, but they want low-carbon natural food systems, and sometimes those things are in tension. So I worry that this sort of moral renaissance in terms of thinking of our food system might also be in strong tension with the kinds of technological innovations. So I do think there's a room for people to make stronger connections between the role of technology and achieving the kind of social benefits and goals that I think many people in that, especially that age group, want to see. I think they are not always aware that genetically modified foods, for example, can help a farmer meet the food security demands of the household. But I also worry that there's a limit to that. And so that's exactly what we're trying to explore.
Tom, I think I maybe can guess what you might want to say, but go ahead.
Well, yeah. Two things. I mean, I think in terms of the moral issue around food consumption, that it might be useful to look at what's happened in the last decade or so about animal welfare, where you've had major corporations like McDonald's say we're no longer, all our eggs will be cage-free. And so that there's really been huge transitions around animal welfare issues. And my sense is that the major corporations are very attentive to what consumers think about that. On the issue of GMOs in general, but also RGBH in particular, I guess I will tell my little analogy. So part of the time I live in rural Vermont in the dairying area, and I saw one of my neighbors, who was an old dairy farmer, buying, back when Vermont used to label it RGBH-free milk, and I asked him, Walter, why are you doing that? And he said, 100 weight's too cheap. All the stuff around GMOs, what he meant by that is that milk is sold by the 100 weight. That his neighbors who were still in dairying couldn't earn a living, and RGBH was just making that worse because of the milk prices. And the point I want to make about that is that a lot of stuff around farming is like coal mining. There's a lifestyle associated with it that has a lot of impact on the implementation feasibility. And so I think we have to be very attentive to the viewpoints of people who could be strong sources of resistance to various strategies if we don't put those strategies together in ways that make sense to them, if we seem to be threatening their lifestyle and their livelihood.
Yeah, this was getting toward where I thought you were going, which was the question, the issue of the need with any kind of emerging technology to have deliberative processes that involve all the interested and affected parties, rather than going ahead on the basis of what's technically feasible. You need to have that kind of engagement, and that's true in the food domain as in the energy domain.
Just a quick thought. Go, Steph, you're next. Yeah. On this exact same point, if you're going to switch. So just a thought about the value of some interdisciplinary work on this. In the mid-1980s, the first thing I wrote in the legal literature when I was still a student was about the free release of genetically engineered organisms into the environment. And it got the attention of the head of an NGO, and I had a dinner with the head of an NGO, the then EPA administrator, the incoming EPA administrator, and some of the top brass at one or two of the large biotech companies. And I tried to convince them that they had to win the moral war, and the way to do that was, even if it wasn't the most profitable, to advance the products first that were on net socially beneficial. And that when the public became comfortable with that notion, then they could fight their battles about things where they had a little better margin. And they laughed at me as a young law student, didn't know what he was talking about, and then lost their shirts. And so I just think that there's an interesting phenomenon here where the same thing is going to happen, I think, and it's going to require the people who are making that culturally grown meat or whatever to work with the thought leaders in this area to think about what the socially beneficial applications are, and to make sure that if it's the head of Greenpeace or an animal rights organization, that they're comfortable with it, if possible, and then you move it to the market. And that might require a 5-year delay in getting it out there. It might require you make something a little different than you otherwise would. But if you lose that battle, it's done. I think it crystallizes in the public mind, and it's not just about the product itself, it's about what the thought leaders tell people they should be morally activated about.
I have a sort of related question about sort of institutional decision makers and also consumers. I've been looking for a lot of studies on this, but I'm a lawyer, so I don't know if I'm totally unaware of a whole body of literature. But is there a lot of work being done on the interrelationships between consumer choices and institutional choices? That is, I'm thinking about the interrelationship. I've seen some here and there on, for instance, school lunches and whether or not this kind of exposure to additional types of foods transmutes to household kind of choices. This seems like it's relatively little. I don't know about like government institutional sort of things. There could be that in terms of sort of government institutional purchases and sort of household impacts. And I'm wondering if that's a fruitful kind of area to look at the sort of symbiotic relationships between sort of institutional and consumer purchasers.
Well, it's a good question. I think people are thinking about it, but not to the point that they ought to. And I think there's a lot of really interesting, and I use the word spillover in a sort of different way, spillover effects of different kinds of institutional policies that affect behavior in sort of unusual ways, or Yeah, I don't know if Alex is here. I feel like, you probably know more than I because he was looking at spillover behavior or spillover processes from workplaces to home, et cetera. I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
No, yeah. There's some work on spillover of work-related, particularly stress, actually, family stress and work-related stress spilling over. That's the origins I know of the spillover stuff. And as far as like policy, I don't know much really on that stuff.
Yeah, I think this is a big undeveloped area in the larger undeveloped area, in the life cycle analysis. Once you think about life cycle analysis, there are actors at all stages in the life cycle that have the potential to influence each other. And how large that potential is a big question.
Do we have some sense of like what kind of person you could have the most impact in changing their behavior? Like, I think I'm good. If we had the chance to change their behavior.
Hey, cool. Whose behavior do we want to change, or that do we have the most chance for an impact? Do we have a sense of like what kind of person that is? That if we could get them to change, maybe transport or food, who would have the most impact?
Yeah. Again, the question is, are you talking about individuals, or are you talking about actors in other parts of the chain?
That's kind of what I'm asking.
Potential says that the greenhouse gas emissions in food are mostly at the production end.
So there's an interesting chicken and egg problem here. This has been touched on a couple times, I think, today, and about consumers waiting for producers to shift practices because, it's not our responsibility to make these changes, and we're largely beholden to the kinds of systems we live in. But I've also sat in several meetings with private sector sustainability managers saying that we're waiting for consumers to signal to us that they're going to buy. And so I'd love to see some way to think about bringing those, figuring out ways to like make those signals more clear or understand the kinds of the decision-making processes within businesses and how those link up to the way we understand consumer decision-making as well. But you're right. I think we're approaching it from a sort of the stand of looking at for demand to shift, and that could then feed in to production practices, therefore leading to emissions reductions. But that's not the only way this kind of process could get triggered.
There are interesting possibilities. I'm reminded of a paper that I was involved in that was prominently placed, but has sort of... I'm off, yeah. I'm reminded of a paper that I was involved in that was prominently placed that has sort of disappeared into the ether, that was looking at internet purchasing and the potential to put options in internet purchasing of things like buying carbon offsets, of labeling Airbnb units in terms of their energy efficiency, and allowing consumers to take that into account if they wanted to. There's a whole lot of possibilities that are worth exploring that involve connections across different parts of the life cycle.
Right.
So I have a question that two pieces of the data that I'm not sure how inclusive they were and then may lead to something. So Ash, I think in yours there was the listing of started with production and went through. And so does production include resource extraction? So for are we extracting bauxite to make aluminum, or are we recycling existing aluminum to make aluminum? And then on the other end, with food waste, are we including the greenhouse gas emissions associated with landfilling? And then with those, there may be interventions, particularly legal side, that have some meaning depending on how we're looking at those things.
Yes, so I think in the model that you're referring to, that acquisition of the materials is part of the production process. As far as what that means for disposal, I think that there's indirect effects for how disposal then affects production in the future. Say if you're using disposing recyclable aluminum that is then used in the production process for other material goods.
So in environmental law, we have focused on pollution control, and we focused on the production process and a little bit on the waste disposal process. But it does tend to be, or at least historically, it's been eliminate the crisis, and if we were moving a problem from one medium to the other, that was fine. But we pretty much left the process of obtaining the materials without much law. And so there isn't a lot that's putting law into the choice of, do you go out and clear cut an old growth forest or a plantation, or are you mining bauxite, or all the other kinds of things. It's been a low level of intervention from the legal side.
Yeah, even with things like flaring waste methane from shale gas development.
We almost had some rules on that.
I'd like to just kind of, coming back to the food question, kind of raise some complexities about what Mike has raised, tried to raise about. Yes, but you were talking about kind of pushing the beneficial uses of genetically modified food, and I'd argue that if we think about this somewhat through a cultural cognition lens and somewhat through a lens of like the stigma heuristic of risk, that this is tough, because who beneficial to whom and in whose eyes? Because some of the early stuff coming out on genetically modified food was things like Michael Pollan writing about how GM potatoes allowed farmers to avoid exposure to some really truly just dangerous, awful chemicals. But as kind of Tom alludes to, we don't always think about this from the perspective of what's good to the farmer. And similarly, golden rice is a wonderful example of a completely failed PR effort at trying to make things trying to make things be beneficial. And I think a lot of this may come down to this idea of kind of cultural cognition, and do you feel you have values and culture in common with the people who are both pushing this as a beneficial thing and being the recipients of the benefit, that makes it complex to ask how we judge the morality part.
I'll just very quickly say one thing about that. I think you're right, but at the same time, there's some really interesting research that is showing that people have absolute moral opposition to some of these technologies, biotechnologies, particularly involving natural systems, as tampering with nature in ways that are just overstepping boundaries. And so talking about risks and benefits, finding common ground when you're responding to someone with a deep moral opposition, it's just not, it doesn't seem like it's going to get that far. It's an analogy that I've seen a couple times used in literature is people are deeply morally opposed to selling human organs. And if we came back with a profile of risks and benefits, doesn't matter, right? This is a moral question. And so finding moral common ground is an interesting prospect, and how you try to bridge moral divides, I think, is the kind of framework and the literatures we need to be trying to pull from when we talk about these kinds of biotechnologies.
Yeah, I agree, and I think part of what I'm raising is I think we have cultural divides that make it extra hard to find that common ground.
Agreed, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on, Ash had mentioned who and when, and to your point, Amanda, on the longitudinal data, on generational shifts, I know that's, I'm kind of pushing on a point where you were saying that perhaps you'd want to explore more, but I wanted to know if you had additional thoughts on that, because that seems to be sort of rubber hits the road in terms of whether the transitions are durable, or whether you found a signal, or whether we're really identifying who and when correctly.
I think it was. So on the longitudinal piece, I really don't know, and my next job is to try to see what other historical data is out there. The data you just saw comes from Gallup, and Pew has similar data as well. well, actually the food consumption, yeah, anyway, there's several data sources. And so I don't know if people are going to age out of that. I mean, it does seem like younger generations have always been slightly higher rates of adopting vegetarianism. But what I was not able to see any evidence that, decades ago, the kinds of moral and environmental reasons for vegetarianism were being brought up at the same degree. That's why I think it might be something different going on now, but it's an open question. It's a good question.
Go ahead, Joe Blue.
Thanks for this good discussion. One point on leverage to reaching this, this set of impacts that we're calling indirect impacts. Back to this point of who can we influence. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, but the influence of major companies now taking science-based climate targets that include commitments to scope 3 emissions, I think, is a new opportunity to use the influence and having an accountable actor within the life cycle and within the value chain, in many cases the consumer-facing company, taking a target that then includes its whole value chain. And we're seeing this related to the food sector. You've got McDonald's, you've got Walmart that have PepsiCo. Some of the largest food companies have taken these science-based climate targets, and they've included within those targets, because they have to under the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, their scope 3 emissions, which include 10 times their direct emissions. And in the case of food companies, it reaches out into the land sector, those kind of hard to reach and further from the consumer sources of those emissions. So I think this is something we can talk about when we start talking about the potential of a business wedge, to take advantage of that and to think of other ways to use a new accountable actor within a value chain to try to drive behavior to others within that value chain. And then my question is about plant-based meat substitutes. I didn't hear any talk about those, and I'm wondering if that was intentional or if there's, because you don't think that they are going to have a significant impact, either because of uptake or because their GHG footprint is not as significantly different as we think it is. But I wonder if you could say something about those alternatives.
It's not something we've looked at all that closely. We decided to focus in this project and the kind of literature review that I was referencing. We're focusing on cultured meat because it's such a different technology and it's going after a different market. But I think that's partly maybe an answer to your question is, I think the outlook, and whether it comes to be, we don't know, right? But is that the plant-based meat alternatives are probably going to target a different customer base than the cultured meats. Is that cultured meats could be pulling in animal welfare vegetarians and people who are, having a hard time transitioning away from meat, but are concerned about the environmental footprint of their products. Whereas the plant-based alternatives seem to be getting at the more people who are more concerned with organics, people who are more concerned with genetically modified foods and are looking for cleaner, healthier diets. And so it looks like maybe the consumer segments are very different. And so that one question is, what are they substituting from as they move into these particular kinds of new products? And I think there needs to be a lot of work that looks at that. I mean, if you're transitioning from veganism to cultured meat, then the impact's obviously going to be very different than if you're transitioning from beef to cultured meat, for example. So that's a good question.
Maybe just a quick follow-up on that. I mean, I do only have anecdotal sort of information on this, but it does seem like Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, those particular, I mean, we're not talking about like black bean burgers, right? We're talking about things that are being designed, including lab-designed alternatives in order to mimic the attributes of real meat, right? So it seems like at least the intention is to try to go after folks who care about those aspects rather than, people that are, just want a better black bean burger.
Yeah, agreed, yeah.
I'd like to just throw out an emerging technology that I've recently heard about. I don't know how fast it's likely to emerge, but I would describe it as artificial food ecosystems. And, I give an example of somebody who is using food waste, in this case from a brewery, combined with waste, wood from forest, things that have fallen down in forests, putting them into a vat, feeding them to microorganisms, feeding the microorganisms to fish or shrimp, and growing them for food. and producing as a waste product high-energy wood chips. So I mean, this is another kind of an option that, if it works, might get around some of the moral objections that you've been talking about. What its technical potential is, I don't know yet.
On the question of institutional purchasing, years ago we were in conversations with the GSS on using the systems that we were developing with Walmart and all these other retailers and manufacturers to partner with them. And it ultimately failed on moral grounds, again, because so many people felt like it would be evil for the government to work with the great Satan in Arkansas, Walmart. I think morality really is something that's understudied and really important in all of this. And so a Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, SPLC, was created to work specifically with the federal government and other institutional purchasers. And we're probably going to be using the same system eventually. But there's this sort of odd partnership that separates. But Walmart was persona non grata in D.C. At the time, and maybe, I don't know if they still are or not. But those sorts of moral issues they are just so hard to work through in all of these different issues. And also, to go back to 100-weight, which is in our work with DMI, Dairy Management Incorporated, is the checkoff organization for dairy, which is supposed to increase sales of milk, right? I had a really awkward conversation with them about what I considered to be a really interesting perspective or interesting possibility to decommoditize milk, because milk is largely commodity and commodities are hard to make profits on, through the production of natural alternatives, organic or whatever it was. And I was laughed out of the room, essentially. It was like, no, it was all about 100 weight. It was all about 100 pounds of milk. So it seems like the complexities here go beyond simple benefit cost.
One quick thought in terms of people who are looking for areas to do more research in. Paul, you and I and Mark Cohen and Sharon Shoemake did a paper several years ago, and one of the things we found out is sort of going to your point, Lou, that for carbon labeling initiatives, a great deal of the viability of them, the advantage of them, depends on which products you pick that induce people to shift out of other products that were worse. That you can carbon label products, you need to know what they thought the carbon footprint was, because sometimes people have a misestimate, and if you correctly inform them in a way that induces them to buy more, you caused a problem. So you need to know what the substitution is, and the USDA has big databases on that, but you also need to know what their current beliefs are. So you know when you inform them about accurate information, you induce the behavior change you want to induce, and that's a factor that we need to think about. The last thing I would say on this is that I agree with everyone that the moral aspect of this is critically important, but that I would say that moral norms are shaped inside and outside, and that we now in the last 2 years have seen people who were anti-communist be pro-Russian, and that phenomenon tells you that those are malleable, and that if you don't get ahead of shaping the moral norms in part, and I can imagine, I have no idea, like how does someone in the animal rights community think about lab-grown meat? I can imagine it cutting either way.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but I'll bet someone is going to shape that over the next several years, and then once it locks in, it sort of links in with other identities and so forth, it gets harder to move.
Yeah, I think that, who steps up and which side they fall on this issue. Some of the environmental leaders and organizations that people look to as sort of ethical decision makers in this area is going to be really important, for sure. And I agree. These norms are very open to changing, and that people tend to look to trusted opinion leaders to make these kinds of decisions. So there's an opportunity to steer this in a direction, but I think it does need to involve a lot of conversations and coordination, transparency of the industry as well, because that was a big issue that derailed the GMO industry, is transparency, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think time for the break.
Great, thanks for a fascinating.
Thank you, guys.
Another 15-minute break. We'll reconvene at